Early Wednesday morning, January 13th, at Hannaford Lecture Hall at the University of Southern Maine, about 450 members of the Maine business community attended a presentation called Breakfast with Charlie. It featured USM Muskie School's professor Charles Colgan. He presented his forecast of the future economy of the U.S. and Maine.
The outlook is generally positive for the next couple of years. After that, I have some big questions. We ought to look back on the past 10 years and say, where have we come? Those of you who have attended this event before know that my preference for this calling the past decade has been to use the British term for zero, which is naught. And so the past decade was the noughties. In more ways than one. In fact, if we look at where we were at the end of the decade compared to where we were at the beginning of the decade, we should probably borrow another British expression, this one from the 60s, when a very popular television show there and later migrated to the US, that was the week that was on the air. Well, I think we can say of the noughties that that was the decade that wasn't. In the decade of the noughties, we take from the end of 1999 quarter four to 2009 quarter four. In that decade, population in the U.S. grew by 25.6 million people. Net jobs at the end of the decade were 131,000 over the beginning of the decade. So we grew by 26 million people and managed to produce 131,000 net jobs over 10 years, or a growth rate of 0.5%. In Maine, we were essentially the same thing. The population growth was 44,000. We managed to produce 56 jobs. Job growth is around the corner. Where are the jobs going to come from in the recession? Three sectors will dominate. Health sector will continue to be a major job producer. Nothing unusual here. It was a major job producer in the last decade, both in Maine and in New England and in the U.S. Leisure and hospitality, I expect some rebound in that as consumers get a little more confidence under them and as business travel at a modest level begins to recover. And finally, business and professional services. Of the other sectors, government, retail, construction, and manufacturing, all of them will show positive growth from 2010 third quarter to 2013 fourth quarter. Of these sectors, only business and professional services will recover the jobs lost during the recession. Education and health, which has not declined, will continue to grow. Of the other sectors, the education and health sector and business and professional services, those are the ones that are going to have to lead us out and get us back to where we were in 2008. The other sectors, while there will be job recovery will not be enough to get those sectors back to where we were in 2008. Consumer distress is measured by bankruptcies and foreclosures in Maine. Bankruptcies will not peak until 2011. And will be on a par roughly with the U.S. We will peak a little later than the U.S. Foreclosures in Maine are right on track with the U.S. numbers. So whatever you're reading about in terms of foreclosures at the national level, that's pretty much happening in Maine as well. Median price in Maine is projected to fall 25% peak to trough and recover 11% or 12%. The upshot of this is that Maine housing prices have fallen by about a quarter, but not nearly as far as the 1/3 drop in the U.S. level. Maine housing prices will recover, but so will the U.S. The fiscal stimulus has been the major issue here. The stimulus contributed huge amounts of money in terms of the effects to consumers, the state governments in terms of stabilizing state and local revenues, and in terms of direct government spending. Most of the effects of the stimulus, the vast majority of the effects on GDP, will essentially end in the second quarter of this year. So beginning in the third and fourth quarters of this year, the current stimulus effect will begin to peter out, and something is going to have to take over for it. So let's look at the evidence. In the U.S. economy, The coincident economic indicators, the measure of current period economic activity, have been trending down but flattening out over the last few months, basically since the summer. Leading economic indicators, indicators of what will be happening 3 to 6 months ahead, have been steadily climbing since the spring of 2009. How long is it going to take us to recover to get back to where we were before the recession, which in this case we can define as 2008? I think we will be back to where we were earlier in about a year in terms of GDP for Maine, and that's total output, but 2 to 3 years in terms of employment, and that's my relatively optimistic forecast. So I am optimistic about the economy in the short run, and I'm basically optimistic about the economy in the long run, but my assessment of risks is significant in both the short and the long run. We're not out of the woods yet. We are at the edge of the woods. We can see it from here. Look beyond the trees and see what's beyond it, and you can see we can get there. But the challenges ahead of us are non-trivial. And we are going to have to change some things in order to get there. They will not happen automatically. Thanks.
The Breakfast with Charlie gathering has been an annual event for 16 years. They're sponsored by USM Corporate Partners. Colgan's economic predictions are based on his analysis of employment trends, income, retail sales, and a range of other indicators.